Dead Space 3 is easily the worst mainline entry in the Dead Space franchise. I specify mainline because initiation exists, and despite all its flaws, Dead Space 3 is definitely better than that slideshow compilation disguised as a video game. Still, Dead Space 3 is often considered the game that killed the franchise, the first time at least, and there's been a lot of talk over the years about just what went wrong with the game. Personally, I didn't hate Dead Space 3 when it first launched. The first two games already cemented my love for the series, and I was super hyped for whatever the devs cooked up next. In fact, I was so excited that I replayed the demo for the game dozens of times because my impatient ass just could not wait for the full game. When it did eventually release and I got to experience the full game and everything it had to offer, I had a fun time with it. I never thought that it was as good as its predecessors, but to me it was still more Dead Space to play, and it was exciting to dig through the new lore it brought to the universe. Overall, I liked the game, but I didn't love it. It never got close to being anywhere near the first two in terms of how much I liked it, but still, I didn't hate the game. However, that was 11ish years ago, and since then I have played the game many times. In fact, I just replayed it for this very video, and during said recent playthrough, I realized something about my relationship with this game. Every time I play Dead Space 3, I hate it just a little bit more. Maybe I've just gotten more critical over the years, or maybe the flaws of the game just become more and more apparent with every subsequent playthrough, but either way, the more I play this game, the less I like it. I still don't hate it, mind you, and I still believe that there is a lot to like about this game. Or at the very least, there are some things to like about this game. Even now, there are still aspects of this game that I love and wish were present in a better game. Oh yeah, welcome to the channel. I am Tin from Tin Max, and I am a pretty big fan of Dead Space. It's been one of my favorite series for years at this point, and Dead Space 2 is by far one of my favorite games ever made, possibly my favorite. In this video, I'm going to discuss my thoughts and opinions on Dead Space 3 and yada yada yada, you get the point. I'm gonna go ahead and get on with it. Let's start with the gameplay, just like every other video I've ever made. Dead Space 3's gameplay is pretty much all carried over from Dead Space 2, which is a good call since that game is still the best one gameplay wise, and no, you cannot change my mind about that. There are a couple of additions. For example, Isaac can now combat roll, which is definitely something. I'll get deeper into it in a second, but Dead Space 3 is the entry in the series where they went full Resident Evil 6. It's basically an action game first and foremost, hence the inclusion of the bizarre and out of place combat roll. It just feels off to see Isaac roll away from his enemies, especially considering that the slower and limited maneuverability of the character was such a staple of the first game. I suppose it makes sense as something Carver, the co-op partner's character, could do, but the whole point of Isaac is that he's just an engineer thrown into these insane situations. He's not a soldier. Gameplay wise, it doesn't really seem to have any practical use anyway, so it's just kind of a pointless inclusion. The other gameplay addition is obviously the entirety of the co-opness someone thought this game needed. For those of you who don't know and haven't picked up on it by now, Dead Space 3 is a co-op game. A friend can join up with you to fight off necromorphs, and you can play through the entire game together. Hell, Max and I played through most of the game co-op style right here on the channel. We never actually finished the playthrough thanks to my game getting stuck on the searching for additional DLC screen and never actually starting. That got really annoying really quickly, so we quit. That's part of the reason I played the objectively worse PS3 version of the game for this video. Plus, I don't want that stupid ass EA app on my PC. Oh, also no one was watching, so there was that too, I guess. Truthfully, I don't hate the idea of a co-op Dead Space game, just like I don't hate the idea of a co-op Resident Evil game, in theory. To me, the problem with the co-op being such a big part of this game is the fact that it's a mainline entry in the series when it could have been better utilized in a spin-off of some sort. The Dead Space universe has so much potential for unique and interesting stories to tell, so why not use something along those lines as the testing ground for co-op, with co-op being part of the game plan from the beginning, kind of like Dead Space Extraction, an on-the-rails shooter Dead Space game with a pretty decent co-op mode that I talked about in this video if you're curious. The franchise was clearly not a stranger to spin-offs, so why not use that to try out the stuff that might be a little bit more out there. Test the waters a bit more before introducing it in a mainline game, that's all I'm saying. Now I know hindsight is 2020 and all that jazz, and to be fair, Dead Space 3 almost didn't happen at all due to the low sales of Dead Space 2, so a co-op spin-off probably wasn't on the table anyway, but they also could have just not had co-op in the first place, so you know what, we'll call it even. It's this bizarre repeated trend in horror gaming where at some point horror series decide that they need to appeal to as many people as possible, so they throw in elements like co-op to try and achieve some mass appeal that Dead Space unfortunately was never going to reach. Dead Space 2 is an amazing game, but like I mentioned a second ago, it wasn't exactly a smash hit financially. This misguided attempt to hit as many demographics as possible just ends up alienating existing fans while still failing to draw in enough new fans, leading to both poor critical reception and low sales. I don't even hate the co-op. I think a lot of its actual implementation is pretty terrible, but in a bubble separate from all that, it's still you and a friend shooting the limbs off of necromorphs, and that's pretty fun. I really enjoyed playing the game with Max, even if it offered a completely different kind of experience than than the previous 2 Dead Space games. I got to play one of my favorite game series with one of my favorite people, and that's legitimately great. Plus, if we're being completely real, co-op isn't even the biggest issue with Dead Space 3. Actually, you know what, let's get into that now. Dead Space 3 is straight up an action game. It's easily the least scary of the Dead Space games, besides Ignition, not that that means much, and it really hurts the game. One of the things I dislike the most about this game is the inclusion of human enemies, a first for the series, if you don't count the prologue for Extraction, or that time you shot Tideman in the face with a javelin gun. Actually, you know what, just forget I said anything. What I mean is that humans are a main opposing force in the game. You can face off against human enemies before you even see a necromorph. I hate that. I understand the idea of an extremist sect of unitologists that wants to kill Isaac because he can kill markers with the power of his space dementia. In general, I'm a fan of the entire concept of the unitologists and their influence on the universe and story, but honestly, I could just do without all of it here. The cult members you fight are just boring generic Call of Duty light baddies that just suck compared to the unique, mechanically and visually interesting necromorphs. It's one of the most blatant examples of Dead Space 3 stripping out so many elements of Dead Space that made the series special. Another fantastic example revolves around the whole cut off the limbs gameplay thing that is easily one of the most standout mechanics of the Dead Space series, which 3 very much ignores and or negates to a frustrating degree. I mean, the human enemies alone demonstrate this. They obviously don't play into that mechanic at all. They are just boring regular people with boring regular limbs. Past that, even the new necromorphs Dead Space 3 introduces fail to fit in with what the series has done so well before. The worst offenders are the fodder necros, which are just, again, regular looking people, but with ice picks and glowing eyes. They look like basic ass zombies, but with the added gimmick of splitting in half at the waist when enough damage is done. At which point either the legs or the torso transform into what is essentially just a lurker that's easier to hit. Lame. Fodders are so goddamn lame, and the game is littered with them. They are everywhere, despite being the most unimaginative necros ever. And it's not like the rest of the new necros the game introduces are any better. I remember a lot of talk about the new feeder necros before 3 was even released, and the lore behind them is pretty neat. Feeders being a result of chowing down on necromorph flesh. Cool concept, but in game they just look like skinny humans, and mechanically they are just a pack from Dead Space 2 but taller. And I guess you have to sneak around them or whatever. God, there are just so many humanoid enemies in this game, and yeah, necromorphs are made from dead humans and blah blah blah, but at least the ones in previous games got freaky with it. The new enemies are just a massive step down from the first 2 games, and even some of the older necros have updated designs that just look worse. I particularly hate how green they all are. It really takes away from how human they're supposed to look. Can't really make a video about Dead Space 3 without bringing up how they completely reworked the weapons of the game. Rather than buying them from the store or just finding them laying around, you can craft them using resources found throughout the environments. In fact, you have little scavenger robots you can place on resource hotspots that will collect a whole bunch without you really having to do anything. I actually do feel like a lot of time and care went into crafting this crafting system. The amount of options and customizations available to you is pretty neat, and you can build some sick ass guns. It even plays well with Isaac as a character, using his talents as an engineer to build weapons himself from scratch. It makes a lot of sense, and it's a good addition in that regard. The problem is the balance of the game can go right out the window pretty quickly with craftable guns. You can make some incredibly OP stuff that tends to make combat a non-issue, and it's not that hard to do, especially if you are properly using the scavenger bots. Before even the midpoint of the game, you can be packing some serious heat, and it can take away from what little intensity there still is. If making your own weapons is not your thing, can't really blame you there, you can still use blueprints to create existing guns along with some new-ish ones. There's even an unlockable game mode that only lets you use such weapons. No crafting. Personally, I don't particularly mind the crafting system. This rule introduced a pretty cool system that I feel had a lot of potential to build on going forward. That being said, I definitely wouldn't have had a problem with them keeping the original weapon system and having the devs build on that instead. I get what the crafting system is going for, but it does end up feeling a little unnecessary sometimes. Also, I find the beeping the bots make when near a hotspot to be very annoying, and my god, is it frequent. Also, the scavenger bots are the source of probably the dumbest DLC I have ever seen in my life. For the low price of $5, you can buy a personality pack for those stupid little robot that makes them sassy.
I don't quite know how to tell you this, but you look like a giant turtle. Unless one of my optical sensors is malfunctioning, in which case you look like a human wearing a giant turtle.
That is a real DLC EA thought was worth not only making, but also selling. Okay, last thing before we get into the story of the game, because oh boy do I have thoughts about that. Real quick, I want to mention that I really like the locations of the game. Not nearly as much as the Ishimura or the Sprawl, but the game takes you through 3 to 4 major areas that all have decidedly different vibes and atmospheres, which I dig. The game opens on the moon, featuring a speedrun of a necromorph outbreak as you fight your way to escape both the monsters and the unitologists. It reminds me a bit of the Sprawl, and that will always be a good thing. I like that it gives us a nice taste of what average life in the Dead Space universe looks like. life. The game then shoots you into a debris field of 200-year-old man-made ships, long since abandoned. I think this section of the game is meant to create a similar feeling to that of the Ishimura from the first Dead Space game, and while it doesn't really do that, I do think it provides its own unique feel that makes it really cool to explore. It helps that some of the more interesting side missions are in this part of the game. The 200-year-old decrepit ships filled with 200-year-old necromorphs that have just been in some bizarre upside-down hibernation are an awesome concept and could have been committed to a full game. Can't forget the ice planet, featured in basically every bit of advertisement for the game, which is pretty cool too, if not underutilized. I feel like there are gameplay mechanics that could tie into the freezing deserted planet setting that would pair wonderfully with the survival horror elements of the game. For example, when you first land on the planet, you must make your way from one source of warmth to the next without freezing to death in between, and that's a decently compelling use. Unfortunately, it's only a problem for that first little bit, and then it's never used again. I'm not saying it should have lasted the entire game or anything like that. I just think they could have used the uniqueness of a frozen alien zombie infested planet to better exemplify the horror. Regardless, I still like what the game does with its various locations, even if they could have taken them a little further. Dead Space has always shined with its world building and environmental storytelling, and I don't think Dead Space 3 is an exception. Guess what, everybody? It's story time. Story time all the time. Time to talk about the story of Dead Space 3. I'm just gonna go ahead and do a big old spoiler warning now because I don't want to dance around anything that might be considered a spoiler, so hey, you've been warned. The story of Dead Space 3 is an absolute mess. It's all over the place tonally, the characters introduced are fine at best, and it complicates the underlying themes with unnecessary baggage that just drags it way down, and no, I'm not talking about the necromorph lore. It's a narrative that is really hard to defend. Not sure why anyone would want to defend it, but still. Honestly, I think the first mistake Dead Space 3 makes is not making Ellie the main protagonist. I feel like Isaac's story reaches a solid conclusion with the end of Dead Space 2, so Ellie's continued mission to stop the markers makes her the perfect candidate to replace him, while still having him around. I understand the desire to bring him back. He's a fan favorite, and he's been our point of view for the story for 2 games now, but just let the man rest. He's been through enough. Second mistake the story makes is with the playable character the co-op player gets stuck with, John Carver. Is his first name John? I genuinely can't remember, and I could look it up, but I'm not gonna do that. I don't really have anything against Carver. I think he's fine as a character, mostly. The problem with him more so involves how the game chooses to incorporate him into the story, or rather how it doesn't incorporate him into the story. In single player, it feels like the game forgets he exists until the last third of the game, so it has to scramble to give him a character arc in the closing chapters of the story. It feels rushed, or worse, forced, and it doesn't exactly help to make him a compelling or relatable character. At least in co-op mode, there is a bit more development, but it still falls way short. When Max and I were playing through Dead Space 3, I barely felt any narrative difference in nearly every cutscene in the game, despite Carver supposedly being with Isaac literally all of the time. Just like with single player, it didn't seem like the story remembered he existed until the back half of the game. It's bizarre to me because the differences in the story between single player and co-op were barely noticeable when they should be fairly significant. There are co-op exclusive side missions that delve deeper into who Carver is, so at least there's that. Said side missions also feature hallucinations that only the player playing as Carver can see, which is super cool and should have been used more in the rest of the game. It really seems like Carver as a character exists in a state of purgatory. He's Schrodinger's space marine. Resident Evil 5 avoids this issue by having his co-op partner be controlled by AI if not playing co-op. I'm definitely not saying that's what Dead Space 3 should have done, but they could have at least made him feel like he belongs in the story rather than feeling like an afterthought. Third mistake the game makes, and this one might be the most egregious, is the stupid goddamn love triangle. Why is there a love triangle in my Dead Space game? Who signed off on this CW teen drama bullshit? Sorry about that, but my god, do I hate this part of the story. For those of you who don't know, Isaac and Ellie dated in between Dead Space 2 and 3, but broke up because Isaac was totally depressed because of all the trauma and whatnot. Ellie then started dating one of the most obnoxious characters in all of fiction, Robert Norton. Norty is actually the guy who recruits Isaac for an Ellie rescue mission at the beginning of the game, kicking off all of the events to follow. This creates an annoying love triangle dynamic between Isaac, Ellie, and Norton VPN. My only question is, why? Why do this? Who felt the need to inject the story of this game with some weird relationship drama? It's somehow made so much worse by the characterization of Norton. He's basically what would happen if you distilled every cliche rom-com boyfriend who acts like a complete dick for no other reason than to make you cheer for the lead to dump him for the small town horse doctor or whatever Lifetime's got going on these days. He exists just to be hated by the player, and that would be fine, I guess, if it wasn't as subtle as a brick thrown through an airplane window. Maybe it's just me, but if you're determined to have this whack-ass love triangle crap in the game, wouldn't it be way more interesting to make Norton a proper foil to Isaac? Make him a character that has Isaac question who he is and if he's good for Ellie by being the quote-unquote better man. Wouldn't it be way more satisfying for Isaac and Ellie to get together because he betters himself and grows as a person rather than being the nicer guy by default? I don't know, man. I hate this part of the story so much. So much. Moving on from that headache, how about we end with some positivity? There is a part of Dead Space 3's narrative that I absolutely love. The Brethren Moons. Complicated lore made short, the Brother Moons are the final life stage of the necromorphs. They are what is created if Convergence is completed. A giant necromorph the size of a moon, a creature of Lovecraftian proportions. I think they are so awesome, and a satisfying answer to what exactly necromorphs are and what their purpose is. I mean, kind of. They still don't really explain where they come from or what they really are, and a lot of mystery behind the markers is still left unexplored, leaving the door open for more in the future. Dead Space 3 even gives a pretty satisfying explanation for the whole "make us whole" phrase that has become a staple of the series. Basically, the moon for the big ice planet you crash on is basically a brother moon that was stopped mid-convergence by the flash freezing of the planet. This prevented the Necros from ascending and forming the rest of the big bad monster. The incomplete zombie moon is essentially begging for the alien machine that froze the planet to be turned off so convergence can continue and it can be made whole. It's batshit crazy in the best way, and I think it provides a gratifying explanation for a good chunk of the overarching lore of Dead Space. The ending of the game is also close to perfect in my mind, or at least as close to perfect as it can be, with them dragging Isaac back into the mess and tacking on Carver. Isaac fights the moon, he stabs it in the eye repeatedly with markers, which is cool as hell, and kills it, sacrificing himself in the process. The incomplete moon is left incomplete, and the rest of the Brethren moons are kept in the dark about humans. Isaac seemingly dies to end the threat of the necromorphs once and for all. I genuinely see it as an all-in-all good ending, made even better by Isaac surviving and calling for Ellie on the intercom in a post-credits tease.
Ellie? Ellie?
The series could have ended right then and there, and I think it would have been a complete, rewarding finale that still left the door open for more stories to be told in its universe. Throw in the hindsight of knowing that we are not getting a follow-up game anytime soon, if at all, and it could have saved Dead Space fans a bit of heartbreak. Too bad EA shit all over this ending with the Awakened DLC. Okay, so I lied about ending on a good note, because now we gotta address the Awakened DLC that was released a few months after the main game. God, I hate this DLC so much, especially after seeing the ending I was just speaking of again for the first time in several years and being reminded of how the story of these games almost had a decent ending, only for EA/Visceral to completely invalidate that ending for a crappy $10 DLC story. Real quick, let me address the gameplay of Awakened. It's nothing special. It's exactly the same as the main game, but now Isaac hallucinates again. They even reused the boss fight from the end of Dead Space 2, so again, it's really nothing special. The story, however, is where this DLC drives straight off a cliff into a ravine that was already in the process of being carpet bombed. Basically, Isaac and Carver failed to stop the Brethren moons, and now they are searching for Earth. They trick Isaac and Carver into giving up the location of Earth, and dip out to do a big convergence on humanity's home planet. Isaac and Carver escape in the Unitologist ship, arrive at Earth too late, and the game ends with a Brethren moon already attacking Earth, leaving the franchise on a massive cliffhanger that, with the incredible power of retrospection, will never be resolved.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Couldn't just let us have a somewhat conclusive ending. As a long-term fan of this series, it's just so frustrating, especially after seeing how they've treated the franchise since. Alright, video wrap-up time. Replaying Dead Space 3 for this video has really shown me how complicated my feelings for this game are. There's a lot I like about it, and it's still a Dead Space game at the end of the day. Hell, it's a Dead Space game I can play with my best friend, and that's amazing, I love that. But there's also so much about this game I don't like, and I really don't like those things. Whether or not the good parts of Dead Space 3 outweigh the bad parts for me as a fan is something I'm honestly still trying to figure out. Maybe I should just not play the game ever again because it really becomes a worse experience for me every time I do. Eventually, it being a Dead Space game at its core just won't be enough anymore. The nostalgia will subside and the flaws will be too great to ignore. Anyway, dramatic pontificating aside, the bad parts of this one game definitely don't invalidate my love for the series as a whole. I still love Dead Space, and I hope these videos, or at least the first three, help show people why and convince them to check out the franchise themselves. If you haven't, you really should. You could probably skip Dead Space 3, especially if you made it this far in the video, but at the same time, I still think there's a lot of good in that game, so actually I changed my mind, you should give it a try. Or don't, it's whatever. I don't really care either way. If you have played this game or any of the other ones, let me know what you think of them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't watched my previous ones on this series, then make sure to check them out at some point. I think they turned out pretty alright. Thanks for watching, subscribe to the channel to see more stuff like this, and I will see you in whatever we do next.